They burned the records. In the autumn of 1755, in a place called Acadie, British troops marched 418 Acadian men and boys into a wooden parish church at Grand-Pré, locked the doors, and read them an order written in Halifax. While they were inside, the villages outside began to burn, and in the parish registers, baptisms, marriages, burials, the only paper proof of who these families had ever been, the ink curled and disappeared. They had farmed the same tidal coast for 150 years. They had refused quietly and politely to bear arms for either France or Britain. They had been told again and again that this neutrality was a bargain the British Crown would honour. It would not. By the time the deportations ended, nearly half of them were dead. The transport ships had carried them to the 13 colonies, to France, to England, to the Caribbean. Their villages were ash. Their parish registers were gone. The deportation had been designed by every measurable instrument to make a return impossible, and to leave no documentary trace that they had ever existed. You have heard of the Trail of Tears. This is the one that came first. 21 years before the United States existed, the first policy of erasure on this continent, the dress rehearsal. The one almost no one remembers. But the survivors had something the deportation order had not anticipated. They had memory. They had names. They carried both in oral genealogies and in their mouths across an ocean and back. And the descendants, 2.5 centuries later, would write everything down. This is the story of how a people the British Crown tried to erase from the documentary record refused to disappear. To understand what happened in 1755, you have to understand what made these people unusual. Not just French, not just colonists, something stranger. And from a British colonial governor's desk, something far more dangerous. A people who had decided, collectively, to belong to no one but themselves. In the year 1605, 15 years before the Mayflower, French settlers from Poitou, Brittany, and Normandy stepped onto the shore of a place they would call Port Royal. The land was difficult. It was tidal, half-flooded, salt-soaked. Everything anyone knew about European farming said it could not be farmed. So they invented something new. They built dikes, earthen walls, and one-way drainage gates the French called aboiteaux, and they reclaimed thousands of acres of saltwater marsh, season by season, generation by generation. Their fields were richer than any in New England. Their villages were tight, communal, and far enough from the colonial centers of Quebec, Boston, and London that, for a long time, almost nobody noticed they were there. By the time anyone noticed, the Acadians were no longer simply French. They had married into the local Mi'kmaq nation. They had developed their own dialect, their own architecture, their own particular Catholicism. France called them subjects. Britain, after seizing the territory by treaty in 1713, called them subjects too. The Acadians smiled and said neither. When the British demanded an oath of allegiance, the Acadians negotiated a conditional one. They would be loyal in peace, but they would never bear arms. Not against France, not against the Mi'kmaq, not against anyone. For 40 years, that bargain held. For 40 years, Acadie was the strangest thing in colonial North America, a population of roughly 15,000 people who paid taxes to one empire, spoke the language of another, and had quietly decided that empires, in the end, were somebody else's problem. The British called them the French neutrals. Sometimes the term was used with grudging respect. By 1754, it was being used as a slur. War was coming again. The 7 Years' War, what the British colonies would call the French and Indian War, would set the stage for everything that happened next, including the future of an entire continent. And in the spring of 1755, a new lieutenant governor sat in Halifax with a problem. His name was Charles Lawrence. He had been appointed without strong instructions from London. He looked across at 15,000 French-speaking Catholics whose loyalty he could neither verify nor compel. He looked at the rich farmland they sat on, which was wanted for incoming British settlers from New England. And he made a decision that would have been illegal under any reading of British law in any other corner of the empire. He decided to deport them, all of them. In June of 1755, a small French fort called Beauséjour fell to a combined British and New England force. Inside the captured garrison, the British found a handful of Acadian militiamen pressed into service by the French and entirely outside the conditional oath. It was the pretext Lawrence had been waiting for. On July 28th, his council in Halifax voted on the deportation. There was no trial. There was no notice given to the Acadians. There was no consultation with London. The order was simply written, sealed, and distributed to British military commanders in the region. What followed was meticulous, designed, and almost no one in colonial America was supposed to know it had happened. On September 5th, 1755, in the village of Grand-Pré, 418 Acadian men and boys gathered for what they were told was a routine reading of a royal proclamation. They left their homes. They walked to the village church. Once inside, the doors were closed and locked behind them. They were told, in French and in English, that they were prisoners of the crown, that their lands and livestock were forfeit, that their homes would be burned, that they would be loaded onto transport ships and dispersed to the British colonies of the South, and that, by deliberate design, families would be separated, husband from wife, parent from child, brother from brother, so that they could never reconstitute themselves as a people. By winter, Grand-Pré was a field of ash. With the church gone, so were the parish registers. For a people who had no state, no national archive, no civil records office, no birth certificate, the parish books were the only paper that proved a family existed. Baptisms going back to the 1640s. Marriages that bound the dykes and the families and the Mi'kmaq together. Names, dates, pages of careful French script kept by parish priests for 150 years. All of it was now ash on the same wind that carried the smoke from the houses. By the following spring, more than a dozen Acadian villages along the Bay of Fundy had been put to the torch. Beaubassin, which the French had burned themselves 5 years earlier under the direction of a priest named Le Loutre to deny the British a foothold, already lay in ruins. Tatamagouche, the Cobequid settlements, Rivière-au-Canard, these were destroyed in August and September of 1755. On November 15th, British troops under John Thomas burned the village of Tentetmar, near present-day Sackville, New Brunswick, and 97 buildings went up in a single day. A handful of villages survived intact, including Piziguit, which the New England planters would later inherit with the houses still standing. The intent had not been to win a war. It had been to make a return impossible. Lawrence had moved fast on purpose. The order had to be executed before the news could reach London, where, almost certainly, it would have been refused. Here is the part of this story that almost never makes it into the textbooks. The Acadian expulsion is sometimes told as if it were a wartime accident, a tragic but understandable outcome of a colonial war. It was not. It was a policy. It was a written, signed, deliberately rapid policy of ethnic removal. It was the first such policy in modern North American history, executed in 1755, 21 years before the United States existed. It would be studied, replicated, and scaled up by every imperial and colonial power that came after, including in some historians' reading by the United States itself in the chain of removals that culminated in the Trail of Tears. The Acadians were the prototype, the dress rehearsal, the proof of concept. And the most chilling part is this: it almost worked. Roughly 11,500 Acadians were deported between 1755 and 1763. The French would later call the operation le Grand Dérangement, the Great Upheaval, though the name is a gloss applied much later. The British of 1755 had no name for it, because they did not in any official document want to acknowledge what it was. The transport ships sailed for Massachusetts, for Connecticut, for Maryland, for Virginia, for the Carolinas and Georgia. Several colonies refused to accept them and forwarded the refugees onward to England, where they were imprisoned for the duration of the war. Others were sent to France, a country most of them had never seen, where they were herded into camps and kept on starvation rations because they were considered by the French government foreign. Between December 11th and December 13th of 1758, two of the transport ships from the Ile Saint-Jean convoy went down in the North Atlantic. The Violet sank first on the 11th, with roughly 280 Acadians aboard. Then, 2 days later, the Duke William, with another 360. A third ship from the same convoy, the Ruby, had already broken up on the rocks of Pico Island in the Azores, where another 213 Acadians died. By the time the winter ended, of 9 ships that left Ile Saint-Jean that fall, 3 were gone, and more than 800 Acadians had drowned trying to cross. The losses were almost a footnote at the time. They had been catalogued, where they were catalogued at all, as cargo. By the most reliable estimates, somewhere between a third and half of all deported Acadians died. Of disease, of drowning, of starvation, of exposure. Many of the survivors spent the next 2 decades on the move, walking from Maryland to Pennsylvania to Quebec, sailing from Boston to France to Saint-Domingue, looking for the brothers and sisters and parents and children the deportation had been designed to scatter beyond reach. Some of them found one another. Most of them did not. And then, slowly, against every odd, they began to build something new. In February of 1765, a year and a half after the deportations officially ended, a group of Acadian refugees, many of them led by a fugitive resistance fighter named Joseph Broussard, called Beausoleil by his own people, landed at New Orleans in a Louisiana that had just been ceded to Spain, but was still being run by French officials. They had been wandering for 10 years. A short while later, under the first Spanish governor to actually take up his post, the Acadians were offered land. The land was remote, swampy, malarial, bayou country that no European had wanted before. The Acadians took it. They drained it. They farmed it. They invented all over again the village structures and the food and the music their grandparents had carried to a different continent. Their name shortened in the slurred consonants of the local dialect from Acadian to Cajun. Today, the descendants of those exiles number more than 1 million. They speak a French that no one in France speaks. They play a music that no one in Acadie ever heard. They eat a food, the gumbos, the boudin, the étouffées, that no 18th century Acadian farmer would have recognized, but that every one of them somehow made possible. In the Maritimes, in Nova Scotia, in New Brunswick, in the Magdalen Islands, other Acadians did return after 1763, quietly, often without their old land. They rebuilt in the corners where they were allowed to. There are nearly 500,000 of them today. And they began to write everything down. What the parish registers had recorded for the priests, the survivors had carried in their heads. Names, dates, marriages, who was whose cousin, who was whose grandfather. By the 19th century, when Acadian historians began to compile family genealogies from oral memory, what emerged was extraordinary. One of the most thoroughly documented family archives of any colonial diaspora in North America. The deportation had erased the paper. The deportation had not erased the people, and the people had remembered everything. Every 5 years since 1994, the entire global Acadian diaspora has gathered for what they call the Congrès Mondial Acadien, the World Acadian Congress. They come from Louisiana and Maine and France and the Maritimes. They share family trees that were broken by ships in 1755 and reassembled piece by piece over the following 2.5 centuries. The Congress is not, fundamentally, a festival. It is a documentary act, the careful, deliberate, public reconstruction of the records that Charles Lawrence's order tried to make impossible. The British Crown has never formally apologized. But the Acadians, in the end, made themselves harder to erase than the deportation order assumed. You have heard of the Trail of Tears. Now you have heard of the one that came first, the dress rehearsal, the one that almost worked. They burned the records. The survivors wrote every name back down.